Good evening, Facebook friends. We are coming to you live here. I'm with Pastor Eric Vogt.
Cheers.
Not only is he my boss at Travis Park Church, he's our head pastor. He's also a good friend, and he's going to join us on Pub Theology this evening. We are together. We're trying to social distance as best we can, but we just had some great food from Pollos Asados Los Norteños, some of the best char-grilled chicken in town.
You can see my leftovers.
Yeah, it's been great. There's some leftovers here too. So it's really the best char-grilled chicken in town. You know, Eric, HEB even ripped off this place. So if you get a flaming bird from HEB, you're really getting what this place serves every day, thousands of chickens a day in Southeast San Antonio. So support local here at Pub Theology. But hope you can hear us. Please post your comments on our Facebook page or YouTube channel, and we are going to answer all your questions. We used to do Pub Theology where we used to do clergy on a hot seat. So like Eric is our clergy, so you can ask anything about faith, our community, creating the common good. It can be about the pandemic. It can be about the struggles you might be facing. Anything is on topic here at Pub Theology. So cheers. We're drinking some Corona, ironically. I thought it fit well with the meal today. So if you're watching, please post your questions online. Thanks for viewing. If you're also watching, you can share this video. If you can hear us or if you're having trouble hearing us, we're doing this at a different location tonight. So you can just post in the comments if you need to adjust the sound, and we'll do so. So thanks for being here, Eric. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me.
We've worked together now for a little over 2 years, but for the past 6 months, we haven't seen each other that often.
That's right.
Because everything
How many meals have we gotten to share together?
You get like one, two, maybe. Everything is online. We've moved church online, like many churches around the nation, around the world. We've moved online. How are you dealing with this pandemic? How are you as a pastor not only trying to balance, the work of the church, but your family, your community? How are things going in this pandemic?
Yeah, it's a lot, right? It's a lot for all of us, I think. And so, at a day at a time, we're really trying to be faithful to keep doing what we've always been about, right? Like as a church, looking to share God's unconditional love and justice in action. As a family, trying to be wise and safe and keep we have a 5-year-old and an 8-year-old, and trying to keep them going and they're having fun together. So
sure,
lots of biking and swimming to get brother time this summer. But it's been a challenging time. I really miss, I think, especially as Travis Park, but just the church, we're here to embody and practice our faith together. And I think that means something physical. And so trying to adapt that to a virtual setting is challenging.
It is challenging, yeah. And especially in different churches, some churches, a lot of larger churches, people say mega churches, they were so used to like a streaming service because thousands of people may not even attend their church, but watch it on TV or online. More parish-like models, churches that are kind of more in the neighborhoods, might have a streaming service, right, where they just plug and play. But really, all the interactions inside the church, to move that completely from those churches online was probably difficult. But recently, this past Sunday, you actually pulled off a live service.
Well, you did.
I'm trying to know, you preached.
I got to preach live, and that was fun to actually be live with our folks, with your help, kind of doing sort of like Pub Theology, but with pre-recorded pieces for the music and stuff thrown in. So that was cool. It felt a little bit more like, the quote-unquote normal Sunday morning of being together. At least we're sort of able to interact with each other.
Okay.
Like I hope we do tonight.
Yeah, so the question we have for you guys, one of the first questions we want you to kind of ask and post about is, where have you found your faith community in this time of social distancing, in this pandemic? So where have you, maybe you found an online congregation, maybe you've started looking at churches across the world. People have done all different types of things. Where have you found faith during this time? I also, you can post those comments below if you are watching with us, or if you have any questions about that. I also want to thank you for one of our fellow pub theologians. Her name's Pepe. See that mask right there? Do you see that mask right there? She made 100 of these masks, right? They're pretty cool. And she's made thousands of them during the pandemic for senior citizen centers. She contacted our church in Cornerstone Ministries, and I just picked them up. She made 100 of them for us, and they're pretty cool. They're actually like waterproof in a way.
Yeah.
So on the outside, you can like easily clean them with alcohol.
That looks so good.
But they're breathable. So thank you, Pepe. If you're watching, cheers.
Amen.
For helping support the community. And that was just somebody we saw on Pup Theology. So
love it.
Picked it up today.
That's awesome.
And she lives all the way up near Bulverde. So she's just wanted to help out.
Thank you. Thank you. That's embodiment. That's faith in action. And as you know, from being at the hub with Cornerstone Ministries on Sunday morning, we're serving more meals than ever during this time. And that's a real embodiment piece. But man, you know, we have to get creative about how to do it and wanting to do it wisely and safely for everybody.
No, I like your shirt. This is, you know, we're both wearing pretty
we didn't
telling shirts here for Travis Park, but I think Kathleen Labordi will love you because I think she has this sign in her yard.
Yes, we have one. We have a sign in our yard. A friend of ours actually in Austin was kind of started these a few years ago, and glad to share it. Yeah.
That's
Cheers to Kathleen if you're out there.
All right. So Eric, it's also a really stressful time for people. You know, not only was it a stressful time because of the pandemic, which is a worldwide stress for everyone. There's also political stress.
Right.
There's economic stress. There's stress at home that's created because of all those three things.
Yes.
Right. So you might politically disagree, or you might, have children and you're trying to balance work-life marriages and relationships and all these things, and a problem stacks on problem, stress stacks upon stress.
Mm-hmm.
How are you walking through with people? What are you trying to encourage people to manage their stress during these days? As a pastor, if I called you and said, man, I'm overly stressed, but what are we telling people how to manage this uncertain time?
I need a lot of practice as part of what I'm not an expert. I don't feel like, but what I'm trying to do is I think it's really important that we find ways to keep connecting. It can be such an isolating time. And so really it may have to be on Zoom, but to have friends that you're really turning to and being open with, once you start sharing, I think you find that everybody is dealing with these same challenges, but we can not only be physically isolated, but I think kind of isolate ourselves within ourselves, not want to bring up some of the emotions and the challenges and the stresses. So having a couple of friends where you can, I hope that those friends come out of places like Pup Theology, that folks can share what's really going on with a couple of good friends. I think that's really important. I think we have to unplug too. Our lives are more plugged in. Our kids, we talk about trying to limit screen time, right? And that's been sort of out the window during COVID era.
Sure.
But we all need to find that time, I think, to unplug. And practicing quiet is really, if I can get centered in a place of meditation, centering prayer, really slow down, then I can start to hear from God. I can start to hear that I think God is often more gracious with us than we are with ourselves. Yeah. And so the ways that I'm impatient or angry or, dealing with stress, I can start to tap into God's peace and start to tap into, God sort of saying it's going to be okay.
Well, yeah, one thing I do appreciate about Travis Park is I think a lot of people love that type of community, and usually we stream our service, or we're now going live with our worship service, right? But what a lot of people love probably more than that are these opportunities that you provide, whether that's prayer groups or small groups, Bible study groups, book groups, right? Enneagram groups.
Right.
These are groups that would be normally interacting in a small group anyway. It's pretty natural to do a small group online. And so therefore I see a lot of our congregants really enjoying those moments. Those who take the time to do so, right? Instead of just watching something, even though it's live, or watching Pup Theology, what I miss most about Pup Theology at the Friendly Spot, which they are open again, so support them, is that we could still hang out with one another, right? How many times do you have an opportunity to drink a beer, have a conversation with the superintendent of schools, or with a rabbi that you would normally not interact with, right? So these small group opportunities that are popping up online are kind of natural, but probably more impactful than even just watching a service.
Yes.
Right? And that's we had to retrain ourselves on that, and I think we're providing more of that. But I think that's where the real life comes from. Commenting on Facebook, which you still can do. Somebody can be bold enough to be the first comment person. That's always the thing. But those are just comments, right? We can only do so much with comments. But when you're interacting with an entire Zoom group, you can get a lot more life out of people. And I think people need to find those communities wherever that might be. Even like groups like AA, right, or various forms of addiction groups, they're learning to do this as well, because that's crucial life-saving work, right? And that's my fear. How many things are we missing that are truly life-saving? That's right, because we can't be in person.
I think good conversations are two-way, right? Like, we're not meant to be consumers in front of a screen. Sure. Just audience, but we're meant to be participants. We're meant for a two-way conversation, and so we have to keep finding ways to open that up. I love how we're getting to do that. With Zoom, we're doing some things that we weren't doing. I think we're learning a lot that I don't know that we're going back to normal, but whatever the future holds, I think we're learning some things that we needed to learn, and hopefully we're doing some new things. I love, for instance, our 11 o'clock Sunday school class on Sunday morning on Zoom. We've been talking about racial justice. It was unfortunately really timely that even during Lent, even before COVID, even before George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, we were getting into this together. And so it's been really helpful that we have this interactive space, right, to talk with each other about what's hard.
Sure. Yeah, and that's been crucial, especially that. I want to ask you these questions. So a few months ago, when the unfortunate death of Floyd Cordell happened, right, we had some riots all over the nation. One of those protests were in downtown San Antonio, right? And your church, our church, was vandalized, and you really made it known. And various people, Catherine Lombardi wrote an article. You spoke to the news. Tell us a little bit of that journey since then. What has conspired since working with the city of San Antonio, working with the gentleman who was what would be the right word?
He was arrested.
For those. So tell us a little bit about that journey, and what was it like to walk through so much pain and suffering with the community? You've done a great job supporting Black Lives Matter, the movement, going to marches, many of them happening right outside of our doors at Travis Park. But tell us a little bit about that journey of seeing the videotape. There's videotapes of people vandalizing our church online through various people and journalists. Mm-hmm. Tell us what the city did and what our church responded.
Yeah. And this started long before I got there. I think Travis Park has wanted to be rooted in downtown and really be a good neighbor, a listening neighbor, and think about what it means. How do we love the people that are in closest proximity? And so, across the street is Travis Park. And man, it was a powerful time, a peaceful protest. So many people, I've been to a lot of rallies and protests and things in Travis Park, but I've never seen one nearly as big as that first day, May 30th, I think it was, that Saturday. And it was powerful to be a part of that. My kids came, we were social distancing as best as we could, and it was a powerful time. I went home and, everything just seemed okay. Yeah. And then, that night, a few people, just a and I even hate to, I said this to the news, I hate to even connect it really to the protest that happened earlier that day. But for whatever reason, some people needed to express their anger. And I think that's what, we need to understand that that's what's going on. Sure. That some folks expressed their anger by damaging property downtown. And among that was the front doors and windows of our church were broken. But, we immediately kind of wanted to get out there and say we support Black Lives Matter. We feel like, I don't, as a white person, totally understand, but it's understandable that people would be so angry, and that gets expressed in all kinds of ways. And we want to be listening. We want to be amplifying voices at the margin. It's sort of what we do and what we said, from day one. Well, I had no idea, and we said, we don't have a lot of money or resources. I would love to put it into other things, but we can handle this. And the church, in some ways, has meant we've both talked about how the church is here. Kathleen talked about this, to bear the pain. We believe Jesus bore our pain continues to bear our pain. We want to bear pain for the community around us. And so we said, it's okay, right? Like, we don't love it, but it's okay. Sure. And then, but I didn't expect anything more would really happen after that. Property damage, they kind of locked down downtown, and property damage sort of stopped in the next few days, and more peaceful protests. But a couple days later, because of this video online, one of the people was arrested, and he was charged with, I didn't realize this, that if you do property damage to like a church or a school or other kind of government building, like public kinds of buildings, it's a bigger crime than just doing any other kind of.
Now this video was formed, I think, filmed by a journalist, right? It was a journalist.
Yeah.
Cora.
That's
my puppy. Sorry.
Somebody put it on YouTube.
Yeah, and so a journalist was downtown, and they were covering this, and they filmed some young adults not only vandalizing the church, but places around.
They were kind of going all over downtown.
And the police got a hold of that and made arrests.
Right.
So
this is a few days after we found out that this guy had been arrested, and we felt like we'd already kind of said, like, we don't this isn't maybe the most constructive way of going about protests, but we want to support the movement.
Sure.
And we don't want to hold it really against this young man. Turns out he's 21, didn't have any previous record. But there was a second felony charge that they charged him with rioting. And so both of these, but particularly the rioting charge, really came with a very high bail. And he was going to be in jail for a while. And he was, but during that time, and I think one of the lessons for me is, I think, in my privilege, it can be easy for me to just sort of say, okay, well, now that the arrest is made, I'm sort of out of it. The system is there to take care of it, or whatever, and it becomes very impersonal. But what we really tried to do, and I have to give a shout out to George Taylor, one of our congregation members, who's a criminal defense attorney, and knew the system, had been a prosecutor before, and really hooked us up with the district attorney's office, and they were surprisingly responsive. At first, I think they wanted a harsher punishment for this young man, but as we talked to them, I think we really worked, and particularly when I got to appear in Judge Ron Hell's court, which was a great sort of full circle thing. Yeah. He's on the advisory board of Corazon Ministries, our ministry, with folks on the street. And first thing Judge Ron Hell said in court was, I may have to sort of recuse myself. I have this relationship with Corazon Ministries, and Eric's going to be testifying. And so, but we presented this victim impact letter and said, the banner was on our tower that day, and it's still there today. That we believe, and we try to practice, that love is always the answer to hate. Yeah. And so we said, we want to explore, like, what does it look like to try and build a two-way relationship and love our neighbors and love this young man the best that we could. And so we suggested that he might have a probation period, and said we would love it if he would come and do community service with us, with Travis Park and with Corazon Ministries. And so that's what they did, and what they agreed to, which is, I think, the most important part, even as we think about the larger systems of our criminal justice system. If he goes by the terms of this probation period, he will not have a felony record going forward.
Wow.
So I think that's powerful, because a felony, you can't vote, you can't get a job, it's hard to get an apartment, like, you're 21, and that's going to follow you, like, for the rest of your life. If you have to check that box, this isn't even been convicted of.
One thing I think we learned is that even though we did not press charges, right? So we said we're not going to press charges. It doesn't even matter what we say if the DA wants to press charges, especially when it comes to buildings of downtown or Bear County.
Yeah, and I don't know if anyone else was arrested in conjunction with these riots. And so, in some ways, and I mean, there was a way that maybe they kind of want to make an example of this guy.
And I know, so you went to court, you spoke, you did an impact letter, and he now is got community service instead of being on this record. So I think that's a powerful way to walk through with someone.
Right.
Because I think in multiple times we've said, Kathleen said it, we said it, this church has been around, Travis Park Church, so you're about to celebrate 175 years, right?
Yes.
You think about
Which is
175.
crazy.
Yeah. 175 years. It's the oldest Protestant church along with First Pres in San Antonio.
And I'm relatively new to San Antonio. I love that about San Antonio. That we just had 300.
Yeah.
Most places in Texas you go, nothing is 175 years old. I mean, Texas, the state of Texas, the Republic of Texas is barely that old. And so it's cool to be a part of a community with so many roots and so much legacy that's been passed down to us that we have to steward for the future.
No, yeah, that's amazing because if you think about, 175 years, for over half of that time, 300, there was just the Catholic Church, right? If you think about Protestants and Catholics and how people were moving around the United States and Texas and Mexico and Latin America, you think about these different religious groups that existed within these cultures,
right?
And so even Protestants even if people were Protestant, they just were Catholic here.
Sure. Until
Until about 175 years ago, when ministers were even teaming up, like the first Presbyterian who became the first Presbyterian minister, whose last name was McCullough. McCullough, we know them as, the street McCullough, was actually going around with our Methodist minister, the first pastor.
The Methodist and the Presbyterian kind of working together
and they would go town in Texas. They were not, these two ministers of Presbyterian and Methodist did not only originally preach just in San Antonio. For about 2 years, they were trying to figure out where they wanted to be. Yep. They finally both chose San Antonio. Their denominations gave them individual parishes, and that's how First Presbyterian and Travis Park came to be in downtown.
Right.
Soon to follow would be St. Mark's Episcopal and other Lutheran churches. But that's just amazing to me to think that the church is 175 years and has seen everything really almost since past the Alamo, right? The Alamo was just done.
Right.
So it means it saw the Civil War, right? It's seen World War I, World War II, and unfortunately we're basing this all around wars, but also the Civil War, plagues, Spanish flu.
Right.
And so at some point, some minister at Travis Park Church had to figure out how to handle the Civil War, how to handle the Spanish flu, how to handle internment camps. Travis Park in World War II time opened their doors to people trying to avoid internment camps. Just recently, y'all opened your doors to thousands of migrants, 22,000 migrants that were trying to find host homes all over the nation. So when we think about this in context, I think you always reminded us that this church will withstand this struggle, and we will speak into this struggle and listen in this struggle, and we will also become better because of it. Yeah. And I think your journey with that individual was a fascinating and also really meaningful journey, because I don't think without the support of the church and with good people like great lawyers that we had helping defend that, that individual probably would have received a really, really harsh punishment. But we were able to use grace. And even that was controversial. I know some people looked at us and said, you're being too nice.
You're enabling bad behavior.
You're enabling bad behavior, which we could spend a lot of times of how that's really not true, right? That bad behavior was already done, first of all. It already happened. Right. And how do we respond to behavior that's already happened, right? So I don't think it's like, that, yeah. So, but I think that's an interesting thing, that there's a lot of people within even our world that had different opinions about this. But yet, this is how we were able to walk through, still honor the DA, still honor the judge, still honor the police department in some ways, right? But also, really, most importantly, honor the person whose life is at stake here. Right. I know there's a lot.
I think that's a theme through so much, and it is great to look at it being bigger than us. Yeah. Or, the last few years, like, we are here to offer sanctuary. We're here to offer shelter, and that comes in all kinds of forms: physical, spiritual, mental, emotional, social. We want to offer that in all kinds of ways, but this is not new to us, or not new to what I believe is God's work in the world. That folks have been doing it before us and helping giving us gifts and lessons that we can pass along. So, I think when you talked about how do we get peace, how do we deal with the stress of this time, for me, getting what somebody calls balcony time, where I kind of back up from the tunnel vision that I have about all the problems and stress of today, and realize like this is not new to God. This is not new to the church. Like other folks have walked through hard things before, and we're here, right? Like we are the proof that people before us were resilient, right? And so I gained some resilience, I think, and some peace from getting a little bit removed and seeing in the big picture, folks have handled stuff like this before.
Now, before you came to San Antonio, you helped found a church on the east side of Austin, Texas.
Yes.
Austin, Texas east side is actually very similar to probably San Antonio's east side. It was going through some gentrification. It was trying to figure out how to do that as best as possible, which there were some many problems there, right? And you helped plant a church called the Servant Church in an older church on the east side.
Yes.
The Methodist church was kind of in retirement age, and it didn't know its future, so you planted a church inside that building. You coexisted for a while. Tell us what you learned from that 10-year journey, right? That was kind of like, I think, your first major pastoral gig after seminary, right? Like major, yeah. And so full-time head pastor.
Right.
And you found yourself in Austin planting a church. Tell us a little bit about that experience and how much that is different compared to maybe pastoring a more founded like church, historic church, in Methodism. So first you get to see both ends. You get to see a church at its birth and a church in the middle of its 175th year.
Yeah, it's wild to me. I was on a Zoom call and the current pastor, Pastor Kelly Schoenfeld, give her a shout out.
Of Servant Church.
She did an interview with a few of us who've been previous staff at Servant Church, and that was on Monday night because this Sunday they are celebrating their 10th anniversary.
Yeah.
In the middle of the conversations we're having about our 175th anniversary. So I really am living kind of both ends of that spectrum at the same time. Neighborhoods change, and churches aren't always very good at listening and adapting. We move slowly. We like things our way and comfortable. There were times that I was really angry, maybe at previous generations in the ways that really the neighborhood had sort of changed twice. And so this, greatest generation folks, the folks who were there were trying to be so faithful. I mean, they were keeping the doors open with, they would have 10 or 12 people there on a Sunday morning in a big space that was hard for them to, keep on top of. But neighborhoods change, and we as the church are often not as listening, compassionate, agile as we need to be. And so it's a story that's true in so many places, right? But really tried to get to know the neighborhood and be a kind of parent, that first of all, we're going to love our most immediate neighbors, whoever they are. And, then it was a sort of slow work of diplomacy to say, we aren't here to take over this old church building. We're here to help continue the same mission that God's always been about and that y'all have been about. And trying to see the best of how they try to love kids in the neighborhood and, that we could be an extent, we had a new name, but we were just an extension of the things that they'd been about for, they lived for about 65 years.
Wow, that's,
and a lot of them were there, like they'd been there since like they were kids 65 years ago.
So people who are watching live, if you have any questions for Pastor Eric, please post that. Thank you, Karen, for that nice comment. But if you have any questions about anything, really, Pastor Eric is happy to answer those. So please don't be shy and ask those questions.
I'll do my best.
Now, just so people who are watching now or later understand why you would even want to move churches, there's different denominations do it different ways. Some churches post a job and say, we have an opening at First Baptist Church, and they would then Baptist ministers would apply for that position. And the Methodist Church is one of the few denominations, along with the Catholics, really, that do itinerant ministry for the most part of at least of the majority of the clergy. And bishops will then decide where to send certain pastors within their own conference or diocese, as a lot of people see it as. So then about 8 years into your career at Servant Church, the bishop spoke to different people and said, hey, you are now going to move to Travis Park Church.
Right. That was a surprising phone call.
Yeah, probably. Especially one that you helped found.
I was at the Broken Spoke in Austin during South by Southwest. So
Okay.
Very Austin time.
Uh-huh.
And you got this phone call. But sorry, go on.
So my question would be, tell us a little bit about why the Methodists.
Sure.
We've had different denominations on at different times of theology, so this is something that might come. Why Methodists do that? And reason, like maybe the good reasons why.
Right. Sometimes all of us ask why.
And kind of the history there, why it was itinerant, has a little bit to do with our founding, really. And really trying to come in terms with, now you're going to go serve a people who are much different than Austin. You could probably find a church in San Antonio like Servant Church, but Travis Park is Travis Park, and therefore adjusting in that. So tell us a little bit of that personal journey for you.
Sure, it's a great question. I like to say that, especially here in Military City, USA, the only thing I can think of being like a Methodist elder is being in the military.
Sure.
That you get your marching orders and you go. Occasionally, they say the sort of legend is that you get to say no once in your career, and I didn't want. I knew about Travis Park and didn't want to. But it was especially being the founding pastor, right? To leave the community that you started from scratch was hard. But most congregations, most denominations talk about calling a pastor, right? So we hire our pastor, and we believe that hopefully the Holy Spirit is involved in who we call and how we call and when we call, and that works in a two-way way. That the pastor who's coming and their family hear the same thing from the Holy Spirit that the congregation is hearing. But we talk about a sent ministry rather than a called ministry in a way.
Sure.
So there's sort of this, kind of missionary impulse, I think, in our church to say the bigger church, we have all these resources, including human resources, people,
Sure.
To share, and we can collectively think about how to best distribute those resources for a geographic area. So our area, the Rio Texas Conference of the United Methodist Church, is like 350 churches, from Austin east to like Victoria, west to like Junction or somewhere out in West Texas somewhere, and then down to the border.
Yeah, down to south.
It's 350 churches, something like 600 or maybe more like active pastors, and at our best, again, I think we think about all of us being one church serving this whole big geographic area rather than each of us serving sort of individual churches. That's hard, and you really have to trust the leadership and that the Holy Spirit is in the way that the cabinet, and
Sure.
the cabinet is like the lieutenants, the district superintendents would work with the bishop to see the needs of the area.
And in the history of Methodism, at the time when Methodism was growing at its height, right? John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, he came to the States a few times, but he really sent some of his leaders over to
From
really
England,
to tackle the Western frontier that was happening in the United States. And so everybody was stationed in Georgia or North Carolina or the East,
Right.
and they were sent basically in wagon and horseback to go to these towns.
Right.
And at the height of America's Western growth, Methodist was the largest denomination. There are still more Methodist church buildings in all these towns. Now, whether they're still Methodist is one thing, than any other church.
I don't know if I knew that.
Yeah, in any other Protestant church, there's still more original Methodist buildings because they would go to these towns, and whether they liked it or not, they were going to get a Methodist
That's right.
parish. That's probably bad things
And
about
then,
it.
like John Wesley did this, who worked with McCullough to start the church in San Antonio, then they kept on going.
Yeah, they kept
Right?
on
They were
going.
like, all right, you guys get together. And I think this can be church at its best. It's like meeting in somebody's house, looking out for each other, saying, how is it with your soul? How can we care for our neighbors? And so these little churches became part of what they call the circuit for the circuit riders. And so you wouldn't necessarily have a pastor or building all the time, but a pastor would come down and visit you and And then eventually, yeah.
And there's still a few 2-point, 3-point charges, meaning there are clergy, right? Like you could be a head pastor at 3 churches around a certain smaller area.
Right.
And
they are probably especially appreciating the church on Zoom.
I actually know,
because before they were having to drive 80 miles an hour on some back highway.
I know
Sunday morning.
A Lutheran pastor in Irvine, so they have a similar issue. So this Lutheran minister has a point charge, actually at a Wesleyan congregation, and 2 Lutheran. They decided, hey, let's just go get the same guy. And the cops will not pull him over on a Sunday because they know he's going to 3 churches within like a 2-hour.
Put the pastor siren on top.
But I understand the historical relevance of itinerant system. However, what I think the most important theological one is a lot of times when churches hire who they want, they say, oh, we want to hire Eric because he's this, he believes this, and they get to pick their gospel, right? So they say, we want to match up with this person, but really the gospel is supposed to be a little bit more challenging than that.
What we want is not always what we need.
Exactly. Right? So hopefully there's a system that's kind of both ways, where a congregation doesn't get to totally decide what they want.
They have input.
But yet they're still going to get a message that's not cookie cutter, that's not going to just be what they want. And that's how we grow. Yeah. If we get to the person we want, then you just have that person speak once and we say that we all agree. Then we never have to meet on a Sunday morning ever again. We all come to agreement.
Right.
Why waste our time? But really the gospel is supposed to be remembered each and every week. That's not easy. So having that perspective of something that you didn't choose is an important spiritual discipline that I think we forget.
That's right.
Especially in American Christianity, where most people choose to drive to the north side because they have a better band, or they have a better preacher, or they have a better whatever. But it's consumer.
Or now, tune into whoever you want on YouTube.
It's consumeristic. You can just watch. Where the original hope of Methodism was to be a little bit more challenging, a little bit more discipleship, a little bit more intentionality in this community. Right, and so I really appreciate about Methodism. I always have. Now I work at Travis Park Church that is a historically Methodist church, but I've worked with the Episcopalians. I've worked with the Baptists. I grew up Church of Christ. I think I might be missing one there, but
and they all have gifts.
They all have gifts.
And I mean, even with the theology community, right? Like if you do community with anybody, your roommate, for any length of time, you're going to discover that eventually, as much as you thought that you belonged together, your spouse. That you have differences. Sure. And you sort of have to choose, like, am I going to resist their differences and say my way is the right way? Or am I going to learn from their differences and let them complement, that together we might be more than the sum of our parts? And I think that's a really good point. I hope that we can do that as Methodists. And so it does. Like the spiritual exercise of kind of an arranged marriage.
Sure.
I used to work with South Asian students at the University of Texas at Austin. And, a lot of their parents had arranged marriages, and the parents wanted some of them to have arranged marriages, which is really strange in our culture, right? But the gift of arranged marriages is that you learn to make it work. You bloom where you're planted, which we kind of have to do anyway,
sure,
right? But we know going in that that's what you're going to have to do. And so I do think that there's gifts in lots of different systems. No system is perfect, but at its best, I think if we press into it in the right way, our system can lead to that kind of bloom where you're planted.
Cool.
Make the best of the community that you're given.
Now you're now at Travis Park, so you're in. What's obviously we can probably think of some of the bigger. What was the most shocking part walking from servant church one Sunday, the next Sunday you're at? What was the most challenging transitional aspect of that journey?
Yeah. We have so much in common that both our churches, I think, really wanted to love and serve our neighbors.
Sure. Both progressive.
Yes, both pretty progressive and pretty open about that. I think at Travis Park, we're always, how do we bring along our tradition and how do we adapt it? And because of this length of time and sort of historic Methodism, it's been sort of mother church for tons of Methodist churches in our area, right? Like the big all 350 churches used to gather once a year. They still do gather once a year, but it used to happen at Travis Park. So it has this sort of historical weight. And I think Travis Park as a congregation is trying to figure out, what do we do with our Methodist tradition? What do we do, you know? And so that was a very different kind of conversation, or even sort of the structures of that, right? Like there are tons of resources, you know, tons of space that we use during the migrant overnight shelter. Tons of resources that came with this kind of legacy and history that we didn't have at Sermon.
Yeah.
But it also came with, you know, things that just Methodists do. Or just that we've sort of unexamined, or we'd like to change, but we haven't yet,
or just the historical baggage that comes with anything that's 175 years old.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah, it was getting there on the first day. You know, it was not like getting into a lot of church. You know, a lot of churches, the first thing the pastor is like, you know, when can I move the American flag?
Yeah.
Right. Because you know, our faith is not about nationalism. There's a place for our kind of patriotism, I think. We could talk about that. But you know, we're here in a cross-cultural way, you know, to be part of God's one big church that transcends nation and culture. And that's what we want to remember when we're in this space together. But so, you know, that wasn't the problem.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah,
But
there's other ways to be stubborn.
Right.
Like, I mean, all communities are going to be stubborn about something.
Sure.
I don't care how progressive you are or how conservative you are. There's still going to be aspects.
And you don't always know what those things are until you step on them.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Just like some other pastor moving the flag, somebody will notice. For us, it was, you know, we were putting the liturgy together for, you know, what we do in worship each week. And we had 2 services then. We combined them so that more of our diversity can be together. But at the time, one service was doing communion every week. And we have this prayer after we receive communion that we share together, that has that part that I talk about in the banner that says, you know, basically it says we want all of our tables throughout the week to be like this table, the Lord's table, Jesus' table, where all are welcome and where love is always the answer to hate. And that was just something that, especially for this service where they had communion every week, that was a prayer that they were praying every week. Well, no one told us that was a prayer that they were praying every week. So we did it the first week because it was sort of handed to us. Sure. And then the second week we were like, okay, well, let's write or find some different prayer after receiving. And so we did that, and it was like, whoa, that is something that you can't change. And I'm so glad that we learned that, because that's one of my favorite parts of it.
It is. And what's funny is I didn't know how sacred that was. I was actually going to meet, I think, with one of our council members or mayor, and they moved. They're not in City Hall right now. They're like in a building over.
Right.
And so to get that building ready, they tried to make it as San Antonio as possible.
Sure.
Right. Looking at different pictures or artwork. But one of the art pieces was our prayer. So it was our picture, like a silhouette of our steeple.
Oh, yes. This was Cyril Dimitru, who's a poet, who's part of our congregation, who's written this poem, and they were displayed there at
and one of them was the prayer. And so I didn't even know. All of a sudden I was like, hey, the prayer we say at the end of our service is on the walkway to the mayor's office.
Right.
And I thought that was another interesting impact. What I think, I've worked at many churches, some very large churches in San Antonio, some that used to be large, some of them are large now, some of them are kind of more historical Episcopal churches. But all of them were fairly large for their own denomination.
Right.
And they have thousands of members, 6,000, 10,000. Trinity Baptist at one point was 15,000. I mean, in the 50s, it was
a mega church in its day.
They didn't have the word mega church yet.
Right.
It was just like, this could be, right?
Right.
They had a roller skating rink at the time. And so impact for them meant how much we can do, right? And they did have a fairly big imprint of our city. But their numbers make that imprint. You got 10,000 people, your footprint's just going to be big because you have 10,000 people all over the city. I have not seen a congregation ever, especially one I've worked at, that has such a big of an impact in San Antonio with a huge footprint. And you get involved in immigration work, you get involved with acts of reconciliation with the LGBTQ plus community, the work of homelessness in San Antonio. The list can go on, and people know Travis Park Church. They do this ministry. I meet people all the time. But yet, for the last 20 years, the church is not that large.
Right.
And it really makes...
Yeah, I don't know if people know that there are more, when we were in the building, there are more homeless folks, or folks experiencing homelessness, living on the streets in some way,
Sure,
living in their car, or whatever. More of that part of the community is a bigger part of the congregation who's there on Sunday morning than, unfortunately, I feel like sometimes there's maybe 200 people in the sanctuary, and then there's 250 or 300 people right below our feet.
Yeah.
And we're working to bring those communities together. But yeah, it's interesting to me that.
But I look at that book.
We don't have tons of people.
When I encourage churches around 200 people, 300 people, 400 people, I think our total congregation on a given year is probably like 600 or 700, 800 people that use the building, right?
Or 22,000.
Yeah, or 22,000.
That's what I was like. Well, we're a mega church now. I mean, we have
you had 22,000
1,000 people coming through the doors every week.
But it reminded me that even a small parish of 200, if they really work at it, if they really decide to impact the city, you can make just as an impact as those mega churches by doing really amazing work. And I really am impressed. I think when I interviewed at Travis Park, that's the one thing they said, what do you know about Travis Park? And I said, well, I don't know maybe individually what you do is like in your worship service and stuff, but I know exactly what you do, right? In the community, I've actually been a part of it. I've seen it. I've participated. I've volunteered. Even not previously ever calling myself a member of Travis Park Church. And so I really think your membership is really all the volunteers that volunteer at your church. Now, it's so funny. He's making fun of me because I'm saying you. I'm so used to saying you on this.
Sure.
It feels really insincere.
You're part of it too.
It feels insincere to interview somebody and then say we, because then it looks like a commercial. But that's what I really think is fascinating. I know I talked to Pastor Chad, who couldn't be with us tonight, but his church is going through the same thing. How do we be a new church, kind of like Servant Church, but really make a really big impact,
right? And
not just the old ways to make impacts based on numbers or size. So can they be a more impactful church in Southtown at 150 people than going to a place in town that they might grow to 800, but would they still be less influential? I think that's something that Travis Park has really grappled with. It's always not worked to their advantage. I think when they decided this 25, 30 years ago that they were going to be a more intentional outreach church, that came with a cost.
Yes.
Right? There were people who were going to Travis Park that might have liked the idea of a homeless ministry, but when that homeless ministry really started,
it's not easy.
It's not easy. All of a sudden you have people with smelly bodies and torn clothes and probably very awkward background checks. And all of a sudden they're using the same doors on a Sunday. They're taking up space. They're taking up kitchen space. They're disruptive on the streets. All of a sudden, the shine wears off, and they say, you know what? I'd rather go to this church in a different neighborhood because I don't feel comfortable here anymore. And so I know that Travis Park went through that challenge, but they stood the test. They said, no, this is what we're really called to do. And but I don't think if Travis Park would have just stayed I call it the cats to meow, like country club church, we would just be there.
Right.
We would just be a Gothic looking church in downtown San Antonio that some people go to. And guess what? We're still a church that some people go to.
Right.
However, we've aligned ourselves with being really active in our community. And there are other churches like this. I mean, University Presbyterian, Madison Square, I can think the list can go on, where I see these churches that withstood the cost of doing something challenging, maybe something more progressive than most churches at the time, and they took that hit. But that hit is paying forward, and I always want to encourage the good people of Travis Park, or probably some of them are watching. Oh, we do have another comment. It's Karen again, so please feel free to ask Karen. So she says this: my husband Keith and I have benefited from being in the racial justice Sunday school class at Travis Park Church. Thank you. Recently, it felt like a setback when not much of the city funds, as we hoped, were diverted from the police force to services in more economically depressed areas of San Antonio. And this is the question. I'll try to pull up her whole question, but Fitz, do you have any counsel, Eric, about how to take it when we are praying for progress of things, but don't seem to move forward as fast as we want them to? So her question is, there have been marches and marches and protests and even riots about police change. We really want to see sizable police change in San Antonio. There's clergy, there's even diverse clergy, conservative clergy, moderate clergy, that were all at Travis Park saying we need to create change. From voices like Max Lucado to Ed Newton at Community Bible. I mean, those are pretty fairly conservative evangelical churches realizing the change. Even Max Lucado got on his knees and confessed of white supremacy at some point of his life.
Amen.
So we found like this great unity that would have never taken place if it wasn't for the bold leadership of various Black Lives Matter movement groups.
Right.
So we felt this movement. We saw politicians, even ones I love, stand up and say, "We are with you."
Yes.
And then 5 weeks after all of that, they say there's going to be a 5% increase to the overall police department. Now, that they can spin that number to show that they're still giving more to other places. However, it was, like Karen said, very like the wind gets knocked out of you. Like, wow, and we're even a progressive city, much less cities that aren't.
Right.
We couldn't even break even.
Yeah.
We couldn't even just keep it the same. So when we're faced with this, obviously we're going to preach about this this Sunday. I'm preaching at Travis Park this Sunday. So
tune in.
Yeah. So we're going to be talking about like this political life we live in, and a lot of people are suffering. You know, with the loss of Ginsburg, Justice Ginsburg. Like people are like, "Wow, what bad timing!" And now this is going to happen, and you know that could happen the other way too. You know, I'm not trying to take a side politically here. I'm just saying that if it was the other way around and you're a Republican and you're just frustrated that things aren't happening right, how do you can remind people to continue on doing the good work they're supposed to be doing?
Mm-hmm. I think this is one of the biggest reasons that we need communities of faith, that we need each other. That I think alone, and this is how movements work, right? That we can stoke hope for each other in a way that's hard, I think, to maintain on your own. And so I think we had a professor at Duke Divinity School who talked about how the other side of hope is lament, and I think that's really right. That lament by crying out to God and community about what's wrong also reminds us of what we're aiming for, what we're longing for, what we don't have yet. And so I think we need those. So in some ways, I appreciate, Karen, you articulating this question, because it's saying, I am angry, I am disappointed, I am discouraged, I'm frustrated, I feel stuck. And that as we share those kind of lament, this is all throughout the Psalms, right?
Yeah.
As we share those things, somehow this turn happens that we're like, and yet, we believe God is still on the throne, that as Dr. King said, that the arc of history bends toward justice, and that, change takes a long time. And folks older than us, know that better than we do.
Yeah.
But together as a community, I think we become resilient as we lament and then stoke these signs of hope and these encouragement. And the other thing is we have to lift up the small victories, I think, that even like our little racial, we might have 15, 20 people in our class on Sunday morning with Karen, that to me it's a sign of hope, even that we have this group of people talking with each other and recognizing new things about their own history, their past, and the ways that we all deal with this legacy of white supremacy. That's a small victory. Yeah. Now, I don't know how it all adds up.
But there's also small victories. There's also small victories in the sense, and hopefully Karen knows about this as well. I know she was because she was here last week. There's also small political victories, right? In San Antonio, chokeholds are now banned.
Right.
Not just advised against,
no knock warrants.
Yeah, so these things that happened just recently, the the city council passed just a few weeks ago. So when it comes to the budget of the police department, even though that takes a lot of screen time or a lot of press, the real fights are sometimes these chokehold bans, these bans that police departments need to set up where you cannot get rehired in a different department, or by the, if you're a state officer, whether you work for San Antonio Police Department or Bexar County, you're still a state officer, right? And so there needs to be rules that say you cannot get rehired if you do something illegal. Those are different than just funding, right?
Sure.
And also these police contracts. The money we're spending on our department for this budget year has already been set for the most part by the contract. So I think, Karen, the real fight is these contracts, these other areas that are going to be taking longer to have. Unfortunately, those type of changes takes a long time. So the good news is, politically speaking, practically speaking, there is still a lot to yet to be done. Police contracts up for negotiation starting next year. The 2022 budget, it's not even designed yet.
Right.
See, 21 budget was pretty much set in stone 9 months ago, right? So, Karen, I want to remind you just practically too that we're at the very start of this dialogue, and in a year or so, if we see no change, then we really need to step up our game. But our game right now is really day by day tackling certain of these objectives. And even though that was a hard number to see in the face of so much protest, we have to be reminded that some of these bigger issues is what's holding that number back. So I think James.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
James Amerson always reminds us that he's a great minister on the east side of San Antonio, St. Paul Methodist Church, probably almost just as old as Travis Hart Church. It's the oldest African-American congregation in Methodism in San Antonio. It used to be at St. Paul Square, and now is in a different location on the east side. He always, when you speak about these things and you say, oh, these things aren't happening fast enough, I love his voice. Not only is it a person of color, it is a person that has seen this firsthand in his communities, but he always reminds us to see the bigger picture, right? To see the real injustices, to see the stuff that we think we're calling an injustice, but we're missing the bigger injustice.
Yes.
We get distracted by these smaller arguments and miss the overall areas of change.
Yeah.
And I think, and Emerson's very strongly opinionated. He'd probably be watching this and be like, you didn't even mention,
Yeah. And I mean, numbers matter, and budgets are moral documents, and I understand, but I think you're right to say that deeper than just that number is, that represents people. Yeah. And so there's a bigger question about leadership, about openness, accountability. That whatever that number is, we're going to need to work to have the healthiest, most connected to its community police force that we have.
Yeah.
And so, I really think sort of whatever the number is, there's work to be done.
Yeah, there's still very progressive parts of our city that when you speak to these politicians who've been hearing from the people, even though they might be very upset about BLM, right? They also know that in their mind, the police department is something very special to them because it protects their neighborhoods. And so it's also about community education, Karen. It's not just about convincing the 10 people, 11 people who sit on our city council. It's about educating communities to really see the value of shifting money away from the police department, right? Because then you have to convince neighborhood associations, you have to convince people who really value sometimes the work of the police department.
Yeah.
So this number, like you said,
I think even police, I feel like this way when pastors do wrong or in public, right? Like the police should want reform. The good police are looking like they're trying to serve their community, and other people are messing it up. Right?
Yeah.
For them. And all of us in community, I hope we could agree, right, that we're asking police to do lots of things that they aren't trained to do. We need more, mental health first aid. We need social workers. We ask police to do all kinds of things that aren't really about actually like deterring crime.
Yeah. And I think that's really important. And that's just that's a huge shift. I think I understand it. I would love to defund most of the police right now. But how do we really get to that moment without losing focus? See, we don't want to just say, oh, it's not possible.
Well, so yeah, the question isn't the number. The question is, how are we going to do what needs to be done for our community?
Exactly.
Right.
And there's been a great group that's been meeting with Ann Homke and this pastoral group that maybe y'all can meet tomorrow. Y'all do it so early, but there's been great people.
I love 7:30 Zoom calls.
But there are faith groups looking at this longer term approach about making some good changes within the policing areas of our towns or our counties.
Yeah.
And so that's something. And also, I can't lose the fact that we're both cisgender white men talking about this, and so our reality is not going to ever be the same as somebody who is a color or or a woman right now who saw the loss of our justice way more personally than I did. I took it pretty hard. I literally teared up, right? But I was reading a post from Nicole Foy, who's an old journalist in town and an activist. Their daughters are fantastic, and she has 3 activist daughters, and she just wrote a post about what her daughters are feeling this very moment. And even though I was upset, I realized it wasn't upset as that.
Yeah.
So we're all experiencing this trauma in different ways.
Yeah.
And it's been very traumatic in the last year.
Yeah.
And I think it just really matters how we stay above our health. Like, how do we really see positive change, not get discouraged, not get so discouraged that we start doing things that we normally wouldn't do, that we're so upset,
right,
that we're so angry, we're going to do things that aren't going to be helpful,
right,
even if we deem them something just or something needed. And it's hard for me to identify those things right now, so I think that's listening and really truly listening. But listening also takes time, and it's hard, and it's something that I struggle with each and every day, even when we're planning pub theology. What are the guests that we're going to have on? How are we going to have a diverse enough panel? Those things really matter but that takes time, and so I just encourage Karen just to keep at it, right? One thing I do want to, before you have to go, one thing I do also want to ask you about is a little bit to do with what's been happening with BLM, but also politics within the church. It's been a weird 30 years in American history where normally you could have a Democrat Baptist or a Democrat Methodist, and they'd still get along with the Republican Baptist or Republican Methodist. They go to church together. They might have their differences. They might get in arguments like we all do. But now, when I look at these denominations, when I look at people of faith, I really don't even see denominations anymore. I can see traditionalists and contemporaries churches. I can see progressive churches. I can see conservative churches. But right now, in my opinion, I feel like a conservative Methodist has more in common with a conservative Presbyterian than they do with their own brethren or sisters, right? Like, so you would think this Methodist would have a lot more in common no matter what political mindset you were at.
And we do in some ways.
But now it seems the divide is bigger.
We are so polarized.
By politics as the number one area.
Not just in our culture as a whole, but that is true in the church.
So where is good ways the church can get involved in politics? Mm-hmm. Usually people say the way I'm doing it, because I like doing the way I'm doing it.
Yeah.
But in a more holistic approach, a more like, if you step back, what are the right ways that pastors or churches can be involved in the political landscape of their town, their country, and what's not healthy ways? Right.
It's a great question. To me, as faith communities, one thing that we bring is a certain set of lenses that hopefully we bring to the whole world. We say that we want to be about following Jesus and sharing loving God, loving neighbor in the way that he taught us and that he continues to make possible, we believe. And so so we can bring this kind of lens, we bring our texts, but often then our politics or our culture become how we read, we make Jesus in our own image, right? Or we read texts in such a way that it confirms what we wanted it to say to begin with. And I think what we maybe can do is, as faith communities, try to keep going to what we've said are our commonly held authorities, and say, this isn't about red or blue. Let's try to listen to what did Jesus say, and how are we going to try to live it? We have to make some translation. I mean, that's the hard part, right? Like, Jesus is a 2,000-year-old Palestinian Jew with brown skin, didn't live in America. So we have to figure out how to be Jesus people in a very different context. But I think that if we can, again, sort of take a step back, maybe there are some bigger principles of how we can be about, my old professor, like Cornel West said, justice is love in public, right? And so if we're the people who are supposed to be about love, what does that look like justice-wise? And I hope that maybe we could start to agree on some ends, what does the reign of God look like? What is God's will? Now, politically, we might have different ways of getting there, right? But I want to try to believe the best about the people who disagree with me politically, to say, I hope that we're aiming for the same thing. We just have different ways of thinking about how we get there. Now we have to have real conversations, because sometimes maybe we aren't aiming for the same thing.
Sure.
But for example, we're both getting on the path of what is God aiming for.
For example, I'm just going to throw this out there. I'm not taking any, I'm just using this as an example. When we, as a city, debated the Non-Discrimination Act, it was called the NDO. I think at the time our council person in District 1 was David Ronald. He went and proposed this to have a little bit more openness to the NDO, where people could visit hospitals if they weren't married, benefits within city workers. There's a list of things that were up there for people that usually were not allowed to have those benefits if they were in the LGBT community.
Right.
Christians on both sides, clergy on both sides, would go speak to the mayor or to council and say, because of my faith, I want the NDO to pass or not to pass. Both have the right in their religious freedom to have that viewpoint. But when is therefore religious freedom taken advantage of? I think the new definition of religious freedom is, I have the religious freedom to tell you what to do. Right? So if I have the power in religious freedom, I have the freedom now to discriminate against you. Where really religious freedom is, none of those are legitimate tests to discriminate. So therefore, if somebody was trying to discriminate against the Catholic Church because they only had male priests, that would be inappropriate. That is a liturgical right to do so.
Right.
But at the same time, the Catholic Church could not go to the government and say, all of y'all can only have male lawyers or politicians. It wouldn't be appropriate. The liturgical view does not match up with the overall civil rights of a country. That is where clear-cut things. So when I think churches can speak into it, when religious freedom is being taken advantage of by another religious group, we can step in and say, that is not the right definition of religious freedom.
Right.
And here are the historical documents to prove so.
My freedom doesn't get to stomp on your freedom.
And it also reminds people that, it's a slippery slope. They're going to tell the church what to do. No, that's not true either, right? There's a balance there. And so I really think the fight is the definition of religious freedom in our country. Because usually the people who are very pro-religious freedom in the United States, I don't want anybody telling me to not eat my Chick-fil-A, right? Are the same ones who would totally believe in religious freedom if the missionaries they're supporting, and they're more, usually evangelical churches, were getting attacked by a country, if they were in a country and it's more, illegal to apostatize or evangelize. They would say we need a religious freedom in this country, right? So there's value of religious freedom when you're not the majority. So I think you look at the lens of the minority. You say, okay, if I was a Christian in this country, how would I want to be treated? It's kind of like the golden rule.
Right.
But also, if I was a person of a Jewish tradition in a country, how would I want to be treated and still have my right to worship the way I want? That is sometimes easier. We don't have to translate that. That's actually almost a debate about civil rights more than it is about whose religion is better.
Right.
And so I think sometimes clergy get involved in political things, but they're not even defending their religion. They're defending the religions usually of minority groups, right? We're defending a group that we feel like should have equal protection. And that's a core of our faith, but we're not necessarily defending Christianity. We're not.
Right. No, I think in some ways that's the most genuine Christianity that there is. I would say, like, putting other people ahead of yourself.
Yeah.
How, like, this is what we've been preaching on, like the upside down idea of power in the kingdom of God. You know, that we're here to serve, and we're here to, love your enemy. I mean, this is radical stuff, but it's not about upbuilding and protecting your own group.
Yeah, that's right. And that's why I think when somebody says, I'm trying not to name a person or a group, but if somebody in the NDO discussion said, well, the reason I want this discrimination is because it's my faith demands that we are a Christian nation. Well, that's overstepping religious freedom in the name of religious freedom.
Right.
So I think the question is not so much if pastors can be involved or churches can be involved in political discussions. Is that church using their politics to either discriminate or to harm another group of people by doing so, right? And I know people probably can make illustrations and fears about, when progressive people try to limit, things. And I guess if there was a really valid argument, maybe I would say, okay, maybe that's parallel. But usually I hear things like, when somebody says they don't agree with Chick-fil-A, you're trying to shove your progressive values down our throat. But really what they're trying to speak out against is the support of the LGBT community, right? Not so much anti a restaurant, right? So we really have.
It's a symbol.
It's a symbol. Where have you seen yourself at a position where you want to speak about this politician or you want to endorse, but it's not the right thing to do?
Sure.
Do you find yourself in those situations and say, man, we can't do this as a church. We're not going to do this. Where is that line for you?
Yeah. I'm thinking about, again, studied Dr. King some, but he does get quoted a lot, especially by white people. But he did say that the church is not called to be either the master or the servant of the state, but something like a prophet. That whoever is in office, our job is to push them.
Yeah.
Because anyone who's in office is it's only going to be proximate. It's only going to be, we are never going, I don't believe, going to legislate our way into God's will be done on earth as in heaven. I don't think it's possible for us to do that just through government, no matter who you might elect. And so whoever's there, we have to push. I felt like this, at Servant Church, we did some work around immigration, and particularly when there were the unaccompanied minors, 14,
Sure.
something like that.
Yeah.
A lot of progress. I think we can look back and say, I wish we pushed, instead of saying like, oh, well, Obama and they're in power, like our people are in power, I wish we'd said we need to push, no matter who's our people, right? I don't know if I'm answering your
No, I think that's
question.
great. So you're saying be the prophetic, challenging voice of the gospel, even if your person's in power.
Yes.
Not saying your person, I mean like the person you might have voted for.
Right, because it's relative. You're like, oh, maybe I like this person slightly more than this other person.
But therefore, because
either way,
because you voted for them, you feel a little bit more obliged to back off.
Right.
And I think we made those mistakes. I think growing up more conservative in my life, growing up in a community that was more conservative, I usually, when let's say Bush did something early on that I thought was maybe not great, right? I'd be like, well, it's still my guy.
I hope that those who maybe come from a different place than I do, but if you're more theologically, politically conservative, I want them to also be pushing their people.
Sure.
Right? Like, when the church is getting in line just to support, a party, or I think we've put up with way too much.
Yeah, and especially if you think about this two-party system that we have. I mean, not only is the church has to put up, I mean, if you're in Guatemala, I mean, I'm not trying to, you might have 17 parties, right? Well, how does a church navigate 17 parties?
Yes.
But we're only down to 2, really.
Right.
And so therefore, you're almost putting us in a box that this can't exist in. We're not just 2 things, right? The church is not just Democrat or Republican, or just one or the other, or both.
Yeah.
We're not Democrat Republicans.
Right.
Like, you can be a different party that I'm not even thinking of right now.
Yeah.
Right? Libertarian. I remember one time we did a red and blue thing at Pup Theology, and Rhett Smith, who comments a lot, he came with a purple sign. He's like, hey, and there's probably different colors. I don't even know, right? If you're in a different country, those terms don't even exist, Democrat or Republican. It might be a completely different, you may not even have parties, you might have a dictatorship, you might have something just as concerning, right? And so really Christianity does not fit in any of those boxes. And it's been a while since I've heard that we need to be the prophetic challenge to no matter who's in power. Right? And look for those.
And let's not put all our eggs in the basket of like, you know what? Neither Joe Biden nor Donald Trump are going to be our Messiah.
Yeah.
Right?
That's an old Derek Vogt song. There's no Messiah or no Savior on Capitol Hill.
Yeah.
And I also challenge my friends who...
Which isn't to say, the other temptation could be just not to get involved.
Not to get involved.
And I don't think that's okay either.
You need it to be a challenging voice. I love that. I mean, thanks for reminding me that, because I stole Eric's line one time, writing an article, and I'll probably steal that one too. So that's a really good reminder to be the prophetic voice, no matter who's in power. I fully get that.
And I think when you ask, like, where does that line or something, I mean, to me, it's much more about issues.
Sure.
Right? And so, I love that, Shirley Watkins and Rachel Jennings and Susan Snow and folks who have been really involved from our church with Texas Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. And every time there's an execution in Texas, they have a vigil on Main Plaza, right there in front of the courthouse. And they're out there with a big banner saying "Stop Executions." And that's a bigger. We also executed people when Democrats are in power,
sure,
right?
Yeah.
And so we need to push that. And so when we make it about, this is about loving people, I hope, and policy that might better represent how God loves people. We're always pushing, and we don't have to get in bed with kind of one side or the other that way.
So we're at this big divide, bigger than biggest divide probably since the 1960s. I can't speak for generations I wasn't a part of. I feel like sometimes I was a youth minister for a while. Everybody thought the current teenagers were always the worst out of any generation, right? It's in my previous generation, when my parents of the 60s were like, man, my kids of the 90s are out of control. I'm like,
Remember you?
Yeah. So I don't want to overly think of another generation, but we're pretty divided right now. Even so divided that when a progressive church encounters somebody within their church that might be different or maybe more moderate or conservative, which we do have people at Travis Park who are, and that ratio varies depending on where you are. Some churches in Methodism are dead down the middle. If you're in a town, you really might have...
I talk to a pastor, I'm like, that's not our issue, but you have a challenge.
There are
in a different way than our
There are churches that are split 50-50, and it's very painful to walk through a divide like that. How can the progressive church be more open? I'm not talking to radicalism, I'm not talking to the alt communities, but to people who might have different views, but are still wanting to have a conversation, or maybe still wanting to be a part of a faith group that does cortisone or does immigration. That they may not be the most progressive person in the world. How do we not get our guard up and say these folks cannot be with us right now, and still withhold our values to say we're not compromising,
right,
but still love somebody who is not there yet, or maybe not will ever be there yet, but they're still important images of God that need faith communities.
Right.
How do we become more accepting in the progressive world when there's so much there's no room for compromise. Yeah. Compromise is sounding weak. Mm-hmm. So how do you compromise pastoral?
No, the community has to compromise so much as, again, I hope Pub Theology is part of an experiment in doing this. Like, how can we, I want you to say your full opinion, now you can't hurt people. Yeah. Right? And then that is where it gets hard when we feel like, oh, well, your speech or your actions, are hurting people, and that we can't countenance, I think. But I do think that, particularly we who like to talk about inclusion a lot can be pretty good at excluding people who don't exactly line up with what we believe.
Exactly.
With what I believe. Because how can I even talk about what we believe? If we're a real community, we're all going to be slightly different on something. Yeah. And so I think there has to be some way that we're saying, I'm trying to love in this radical way that includes the people I don't agree with. Yeah. That is hard. I know I need help. Maybe some of y'all out there can do it, but I need God and I need community if I'm going to be able to do that.
And compromise isn't really a bad word. I mean, even when we don't want to admit it, no matter who we vote for, we've already compromised. Yeah, because
that's the pushing all the time.
Yeah, like there is not a candidate I've yet voted for that I agree with 100%.
That's perfect.
And so therefore, in my natural being, I've compromised something within myself to vote somehow. That's just the bad part about voting when there's two people's name on the list. So I don't think in the pastoral realm, in the church realm of being with each other in community, I really think that is the best way to see change. I've never seen anybody truly converted to one side or the other when it comes to a political argument, or heck, even a religious argument, or a humanistic argument, or a sexual argument, right? I've never seen anybody flip based on a really good argument. Right. Or a debate.
Yeah, like my mind has changed about a lot of things.
Yeah.
But not because
I've seen
overnight someone debated me into it.
When
churches, you're right.
When churches bring in, we're gonna bring in one side, and sometimes it's churches or universities or think tank groups or different conferences or festivals are gonna bring in somebody. We're gonna have two people have the equal amount of time, and you're gonna like the person usually you've already agreed with to begin with. I've always seen people change, and people do change based on relationships. So therefore, if they have a relationship with somebody who's liberal and they're conservative, or vice versa, or somewhere in between, or whatever dividing I'm still doing right now in this conversation, somebody who may not be fully on board with LGBT issues, somebody who might be fully already there. I've never seen them influence each other without a real relationship. That's how I became more progressive. I went to Focus on the Family Institute. I grew up listening to Focus on the Family. Never really thought they were that great, but that was my upbringing. Sure. So when I went to Duke, I didn't really know, right? And I remember having a hard conversation week one. Somebody found out I went to Focus on the Family Institute, and they lit into me. And they tried to convince me of all the facts. And I went home not convinced. Until I met a person in one of my small groups, right? He was a man, pastor, and he was gay. And to me, I've never really got to know somebody who was a gay minister, right? And it took weeks and weeks of just going and hanging out, not even intentionally. Like we would just talk to each other in line. And over time, I realized that his power to be a minister had nothing to do with his sexuality. Then I started thinking about my sexuality and then everything. And I started forming a different view based on a relationship I had with somebody. I actually don't even know what argument convinced me, other than the fact that it was a relationship, right? So when I look back on the moment I changed, I'm going to say Sanford Groff. Because I don't know when in my relationship with Sanford that I said, that's worth fighting for. Yeah. I just know it was something, conversation.
Hey,
Sanford, he's in Florida now, I think. Ironically, I spoke at one of he was a chaplain at a high school or something, and I spoke at one of it right after the homeless journey, and I was kind of laughing, like, wow, like, this is actually a really meaningful thing to me, because it was not just him, there was other individuals at Divinity School that I slowly, honestly, the basketball committee when I was a part of, that was like my claim to fame, dude, right? Having those conversations with biologists and chemists that I just never would have had changed my perspective on science. Yeah. When I look at your shirt,
science is real.
Yeah,
Can Christians say
I know exactly who convinced me that science is real, and it wasn't because they gave me any scientific facts in an argument. They showed me. So Kim went around to her lab, and she showed me more practical things about science in a relationship that I thought I could trust. You know, Black Lives Matter. I try to read, no means illegal. Going to the caravan. Love is love. These things were all based on relationships of change. And I am afraid if we continue down this journey our nation is going through, we're losing that.
We will all not have the relationships that could lead us to positive change.
And therefore, Karen, your question is even more scary, because if we do not build those genuine relationships, then the delay will happen even longer. So change will take longer to take place when we do not have authentic relationships, even in our own tight-knit communities, right? And learning that compromise is not, especially with like-minded other community groups. I'm not saying you have to get out there and agree and be best friends with somebody in the most opposite perspective out there.
Right.
Start with your closest neighbor and learn to walk through disagreements together. At least you're close.
Right.
You're not going to derail anyone.
Right.
And heck, that's even hard now. You can get your closest, you think you can get your best friend of all that, you've been to every political rally together, and all of a sudden they say something at the table and you're like, wait, what? Yeah. So I really think that's scary to me. I'm more concerned about our lack to truly build real relationships with members of the Black Lives Matters coalitions. Are we really going to truly get to know them? Are we really going to listen, right? Are we really going to listen to our moderate brothers and sisters who really are just trying to navigate the world just like we are?
Yeah.
Are we going to listen to our Catholic brothers and sisters, and our trans brothers and sisters? And that concerns me more than almost winning an argument, because I don't think any argument can be won. So
yeah, I mean, how do people talk about people over principles?
Yeah.
Right? We're so committed to these principles in the abstract that we don't love people. The people who are right in front of us. And I think this brings it back to what we started off talking about during COVID, how important embodiment is. You know, that if it's just an echo chamber and I can tune in to whatever I already agree with and I'm going to listen to, then I don't have to like rub up against anybody else.
It just sounds so cheesy, doesn't it? Like just to say that's it, like love is love. Like it almost sounds too good to be true. So last question.
The truth in the cliches, right?
If you have any last questions, somebody's out there, you can ask us a question that hasn't posted yet.
I want to say one thing.
Okay.
Can I?
Sure.
When we were talking about how Travis Park has a big footprint without a ton of people, one thing you said was we actually do have a ton of people just they don't all look like your average church members.
Yeah.
And they may not be there on Sunday morning. And that is church too, I believe. It's not about we all believe the same thing. We're trying to be agents of God's love together. And that's a big movement that we can be a part of. And Charlie Park isn't the only one who does it.
Yeah.
But I also don't want to romanticize like being small. I mean, yes, Jesus did it with 12.
You're right.
And they multiplied. Margaret Mead said, never believe that, how does it go? That 12 people couldn't change the world. It's actually the only thing that ever has.
Yeah.
So, I mean, mustard seed, like little things multiplied can have big power. But I want to recruit more people. I mean, I want more of you to, and we can learn from you. You don't have to do it just our way. We need to do it your way. But let's get together and be part of this bigger movement. You don't have to put a church label on it, but let's be part of something bigger. And so I love when big churches or little church, whoever can talk about what I try to think about is not seating capacity, because we have a lot of seating capacity in church.
We can social distance great.
That's right. We could have 850 people or something in our sanctuary. It's not about seating capacity. It's about sending capacity. It's about how are we putting people out into the world who are loving their neighbors and learning to do that in hard ways together.
And also, we'll say that the progressive church is fairly large. It's just a lot of progressive Christians have lost faith in a lot of religious institutions. We have to remind our progressive family to still show up on a Sunday morning.
The system wants to divide us,
Yeah.
and the system wants you to give up.
Yeah.
And
The system
so we've
wants
talked
to
about hope, and we've talked about community a lot tonight. And there are a lot of forces that I would say forces of evil, and not people, but these real sort of spiritual forces in our culture that want us to give up and want us to be divided.
Yeah, and that's great because that's true of our moderate and conservative friends. Like, if you feel frustrated, that should not be a reason for you not to show up to a faith group that you might cherish. So
in fact, that faith group might need you to show up and be frustrated so that they can hear and learn and change.
Yeah.
So if
you're progressive out there, this Sunday, show up at least to an online church somewhere. Now, one last question. We'll bring it back to the Bible here. You did a sermon series on the book of Esther just recently.
Yes. That was fun.
It was fun. I wanted you tipped off some pastors because they're now doing Esther, right?
Cool.
And that has to do with some of the relative movements that are happening right now.
It's a great book for thinking about.
Tell us a little bit about what you talked about.
Community organizing.
What's the overall theme of Esther, and why was it relative to what was happening in BLM and in San Antonio and our nation?
Well, one lesson that I think of is Esther was a pretty reluctant prophet, right? Like she had the privilege that she didn't have to get in the fight.
She was very wealthy.
She was very wealthy. She was the queen.
Yeah.
The previous queen, Vashti, had stood up to the king in this sort of feminist way that said, like they ended up saying all wives should submit to husbands or something. The queen stood up to the king and she got banished. So now Esther's the new queen, and she has all this privilege in that the king likes her. She doesn't have to ruffle a lot of feathers. The king actually doesn't know. She hasn't outed herself as being Jewish at this point. This is when the Jews are in exile, and the king is this foreign power. And so she had such privilege that she could have stayed comfortable. But her uncle, sort of surrogate dad, Mordecai, calls her out and says, "You're in this place for a reason at this moment, and you need, remember, these are your people, and you've got to give up some of your privilege and your comfort to speak out." But then and she says, "Well, pray for me. I need this community around me. It's going to be really hard. I might die." And she's willing to sort of take that step boldly. But the other thing that she does is she moves slowly, which I think is, so she invites the king and Haman to a feast, and basically they just have a feast. And they're like, "Well, what did you call us here to talk about?" And she's like, "We're going to have another feast, and then I'll tell you what's going on." And I think there's ways that, we need to be impatient for justice. I think God is impatient for justice in some ways. But we also, I think there's a way that we need a certain kind of patience because we have to cultivate relationships, because it's about people. That Haman doesn't get it so good. But the king changes his mind. Sometimes if you Emily Dickinson said, tell the truth but tell it slant. Like if you just come direct at it as hard and fast as you can, you may end up making enemies or not getting where you really want to go. And so there's a lot of kind of interesting community organizing pieces. There's also a lot of violence that not everything about Esther I think is like lots of scripture. I think lots of things in scripture are descriptive, more about the way things are than prescriptive about the way they should be.
Wow.
So I'm not saying Esther's like the complete model for community.
No, it's one
because
model.
People get eye for an eye thrown up on
That's
crosses, right?
Yeah. So Esther's a great reminder, especially about cultures of privilege, people of privilege with power. So how to navigate through really hard change and really trying to accomplish the better good.
And she's both a minority and has power.
That's right.
Right? And so I think all of us live in this sort of cross-section, the intersectionality of, I don't think we do people justice when we consign you to you're just a disempowered people or you're just a people in power. And that there are cross-sections of that I think can lead to powerful work. But you were going to say something.
No, that was it. That's what that's great. I wanted to kind of end with that. It's really kind of almost past our time. I know that you have, I just posted recently, both Eric and your wife, Valerie, are ministers, and they both have 2 great children. I'm with all parents right now you're trying to navigate, be at home more, online school, jobs.
Praying for all the schools and teachers out there. We are so glad that we got our kids back to in-person school.
I'm grateful for your time. So thank you for taking time to do this. And really, this is kind of what Theology was all about. I can't wait till we get somehow back at a friendly spot or where we're going to be and land. So thank you for coming and really sharing your heart. We also know that to clarify some of the things that cross my brain, at Travis Park Church, we do count everybody who comes through our door. So
Amen.
If you're down at Cortisone getting a meal, that counts as attendance. If you so sometimes we've spoken tonight in these ways of distinguishing different people, whether they're homeless or our traditional parishioners. Really, they're all one.
We are working to be one community.
Yeah,
it's hard work.
It's hard work. So please know that. So when you're like, oh my gosh. But
that's the people. Everybody counts, right? And we need to work at living that way.
No, and also let's just know that we're also 2 people with imperfect language as well, right? So it's very tough as 2 white ministers to be even probably having the right to be on the internet for an hour and 40 minutes talking about problems. Like we realize our own insecurities and what we do not know. And what other people should probably be telling us and encouraging us. So we want to keep that conversation going. At Pub Theology next week, I'm trying to remember, we have Pre-K4SA, the leadership and CEO, I believe, of PK4SA will be interviewed by Becca, who is one of my regular co-hosts. She's also an education reporter, so she'll be covering that upcoming involvement with education. The week after that, we're going to have Erica Steiner, our children's minister, come back to Pub Theology. She hosted a few weeks ago with Samrat Jean Singh. She's going to be interviewing some of this birther movement, just like birthing rights, birthing issues of women, not only cisgender women, but trans women, and the birthing movement. So that will be another Badass Women series. About once a month, we're trying to highlight women in our community who are badass, who are doing amazing things. So she's going to be interviewing some midwives to theologians, to professors, to regular women every day who are just doing amazing work.
That's cool.
In that field.
Thanks, Erica.
And so that's coming up. We're going to be back Pastor Chad. What else have we realized that's going to be on the docket here? But that's the weeks coming up. You can check us out on Pup Theology or Travis Park Church. It's great to be with you, and you're always welcome to come anytime. So thank you for listening. And most people watch this later. So if you're watching this later, please share and tune into Pup Theology anytime. So we're looking again. I'm making the same mistake. We have a different setup today. You're over there. Thanks, guys. Have a
We'd love
great
to hear
evening.
from you. Keep the conversation going.